appearance. I know I look messed up. I had a really bad bout of hay fever and I got no sleep last night, but the brain is still working. I'm a big fan of this whole thing of these historical what ifs. You know, what if Napoleon won the Battle of Waterloo? What if the Third Reich hadn't been defeated? What if D-Day had failed? And one thing that I do love the idea is, I want to talk about in this video is what if Constantine the Great never adopted Christianity in the 3rd century as a method of consolidating the Roman Empire and controlling his subjects, particularly his military force. What if that never happened? And it's a very profound and powerful one to mull over. Well, for starters, just imagine, we go back a bit earlier than that. Just imagine if in those hammer-wielding, bug-eyed, lice-encrusted dregs called the Christians never made their way out of this Syrian desert carrying hammers to smash and destroy 70% of the artwork and knowledge of the ancient classical world. Would we be in a better place? Well, human beings are still human beings at the end of the day. Would we be in a better place? I don't know, but I would just like to think that what would have happened. Assuming the historical timeline that we're given is correct, I'm just assuming for now that this missing Dark Ages, this phantom time theory thing is not right, and we do have the actual standard model of time is correct. The Renaissance would have never happened because there would be no need for it to happen. Remember, the Renaissance was a renaissance of the classical world coming back in the 1500s because it had been destroyed by Christianity. You had you look at the classical pagan world. The cities had sanitation. You had cities the size of Rome that could actually provide the infrastructure and means for 1 million people to exist perfectly fine by those standards. You had this all over the classical world. We don't know. We had roads built everywhere all over Europe. We had shipping and trade routes from Europe as far as Asia, and perhaps even to the Americas. The Christians, using the Bible, said that the world, the classical scholars and everyone in classical time knew that the earth was round, or at least curved. They knew it was curved, but they didn't know it was a complete sphere, because it's obvious to stay. And because in the Bible it says the earth is a flat disc that sits on top of 4 columns, I'm not joking, with the firmament above it, Christians, being Second Temple rabbinical Jews, adopted the Hebrew view of the flat earth. That's what I find interesting about so many of these flat earthers. They're all they're all truthers who hate Jews, and yet they're all propounding a Hebrew view of reality. Ironic, eh? But anyway, not that I have a problem with that. It's just that's where Hebrewism was at that time. So we would have never had a Renaissance because we would have had a continual development of science, technology, art, and culture from the classical era, from the first century. We're just saying from the fictional character Jesus Christ on. So we probably would have had things like aviation and, say, the discoveries of the Industrial Revolution. We'll start with that. We probably would have had that about 1,000 years sooner. So probably about the time of the Normans, the steam engines, we were building steam railways, steamships, because there would be no breakdown in technological, assuming a plague or something didn't happen, and they were on the same trajectory. We would have had that by then. We would have had broadcast radio technology by the 1500s. At the latest, no, probably even earlier, I would say probably about the 1400s, at the very latest the 1500s. And aviation would have followed about 200 or 300 years sooner. And we'd probably be already on Mars by now, and probably most of the planets in the solar system would have been explored at least by unmanned robots. We would have had quantum physics be developed very, very early on, because it would be, like with the Hindus, it would be sympathetic with the pagan worldview. Regarding wars and things like that, well, there'll always be wars. This idea that we give peace a chance and we must love peace, and that's a Christian idea to make you docile. I hate to say it, it's unfortunate, but war has been there since day one. Human beings are a warlike creature. The only thing is to try and tame it by not becoming oppressive. And the Romans, to their credit, did that when they conquered most of Europe and North Africa and the Middle East. They allowed people to have religious freedom. So we wouldn't have had the sectarianism that we have today. They gave them religious freedom. Once you paid your taxes, behaved yourself, you were fine. You were completely fine and left alone. We know what happened with, when they rose up against them, there was total annihilation, like Carthage and the Iceni in Britain. But once you didn't rise up, once you did what you're told, which was pretty lame and tame compared to what came under papal law hundreds of years later, and say British colonial law, much later, 1,000 years later, that was over 1,000 years later, it was fine. It was totally manageable. It was very forward thinking. You were allowed religious freedom and everything. So there wouldn't have been sectarian wars as such. The Roman Empire was multiracial with people from every part of the world. So we probably would never had African slavery. They probably would have had general slavery. And by then you would have had growths in human rights. So the slavery you see, this is another thing. Christians have this idea that morality comes from the Bible. No, sorry, that human decency comes from the Bible. There's lots of cases of human decency in the ancient classical world. I think we would have solved lots of problems like that. I don't think we would have developed many of the neuroses we have now. You look at the classical world, it was very defined between a man, a woman. It was very family orientated. You wouldn't have had that. You wouldn't have this idea of people today chopping off their sexual organs because it's fashionable or they want attention on the internet. You wouldn't have got that. They would have been. Now, another thing too, I'll say, well, what about the Colosseums and killing all the people? And well, that's actually better than going to kill the Cathars or slaughter someone or crusades. If you get the bloodlust is there too. If you take the bloodlust out in a public spectacle, that would have also evolved into sports like we have today, and again, much sooner. What happened is we lost 1,000 years of Western development, and we went backwards 1,000 years in spiritual development. We went back to the Bronze Age, in a Middle Eastern Bronze Age. And this is a great catastrophe for humanity because of the polytheism of paganism and multiple gods and goddesses. You don't have one autocratic dominant god, so therefore you don't have to defend the one true God. If you read Catherine Nixby's The Darkening Age, there's letters from Roman governors who are like holding their heads in their hands saying, why do these Christians their own son sacrificed when all he has to do is go down to executed, when all he has to go to prison, when all he has to do is go to the temple and make a veneration towards Jove or a classical god. And this is the whole thing. Martyrdom came from that as well, religious martyrdom. Regarding the rise of Islam, if Islam probably would have never risen because it is kind of like an offshoot of Christianity. But if Islam had come about, I don't think it would have been the power it is today. I think you would have had people, Europeans, pagans would have been going down to Mali to protect the Dogon tribe from being forcefully converted. That's the kind of freedom we have today. They would not tolerate anyone converting others. Now I know this is all what's if and it could have turned out horrible, but this is just looking at the one scenario, and I'll try and think of things that could have been a bad scenario in this regard. Bad scenarios in this regard might have been, they were probably too fond of conquest. So probably the entire world would have been Europeanized completely, absolutely, to the point where Chinese would be speaking Latin, and that would have been the worst of it. But they wouldn't have. Well, they would have been doing business perhaps in Latin, but I doubt very much. Like the Jews were never forced to learn Latin; they would do business in Latin. So it would probably be like English, an international language. But it wouldn't have been as a product of empire. It would be much more of a product of trade. And you'd find countries like India would probably be great powerhouses, because they would be very compatible with Europe in terms of how they saw the world. You would definitely have avoided things like the Inquisition. You would have avoided the genocide of peoples in Central America. Absolutely, you would have avoided the slaughter of the Native Americans. That would have never happened, because that was absolutely 100% a biblical orientated crusade. In terms of things like climate change, well, if there was an impending climate crisis, Well, you wouldn't have carbon taxes and machines taking out the carbon, the over supply of carbon in the atmosphere. A pagan, because it's not a debt cult like Christianity that worships a dead man on a stick, would plant forests. It would expand forests. It would. That's how it would do it. It would manage the climate through sensible environmental management. They would have not had this idea that you have now within science that we're finished anyway, because their Jesus book tells them that the book of Revelations and the end of the world is coming and they're all going to heaven. And instead of like thinking we got to, and you have people like Brian Cox say we have to go to Mars because the Earth has moved the earth. That's a Christian thing. That's how ironic about all these types. They have Christian biblical mentalities. Pagans would have protected and venerated this earth as a god, as a goddess actually, and they would have protected it and managed it much better environmentally. Even when the Industrial Revolution came along, they would have already been on it, because it would have been seen. You see how they planted there. You see how pre-Abrahamic cultures built gardens. You had great veneration for flowers in gardens. You had goddesses like Flora, not just in Europe, it was in Persia as well. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon. And even you see that in the Asian world, you see that in India, you see that in Japan. This veneration, even though Japan has this complex, urban, vastly populated society, the veneration of nature and the natural, especially the botanical world, is remarkable. Absolutely remarkable. And that would have been central. We would say that would have been central to life. This veneration of nature in a health. There would be no climate catastrophes because, or even if they're true, or any kind of thing like that, because the planet would be naturally managed. You know, as things were happening, like the ice caps were melting, they would find the holistic thing out. So they would see the sun, or probably the sunspots are causing it. They wouldn't necessarily jump on the idea that human beings are wicked creatures upon this earth who are against nature and have to be exterminated or punished with penance, carbon penance, or anything like this. That stuff wouldn't have existed. Of course, all this is a what if, but if anything, this video and this vlog serves to show that we have lost an awful lot. We've lost an awful lot of scientific, spiritual, social and other development, and went back 1,000 years. On my Beyond Room 313 channel, there is a new video on Bren Kelly Dewey, I can't pronounce it. Please forgive me, Welsh people. Gaelic is very different than Welsh, even though they're both Celtic languages. That's just been, it should be going up sometime today, and enjoy this. It's cool here today, but it's beautiful. And take care of yourselves, and add your comments to this. This is a fascinating what if subject. What if these troglodytes never wandered out of the desert of Syria carrying hammers and made the world Christian? What would we be like today?